Wow, talk about a wild week in college football. Week 8 had it all. Upsets, surprises, and some serious shakeups in the rankings. Let's dive right into it, because if you're a Longhorns fan, this one's going to sting a little bit. Expert speaker, you've had some time to look at the carnage that was Week 8. What's the big story?
Well, we've got ourselves a new #1, that's for sure. Texas' reign at the top is over after that loss to Georgia. Looks like Oregon's poised to take over the top spot, but honestly, I think the real story goes way beyond just who's sitting at #1 right now.
Texas fans, you have my sympathies. That was rough. And CBS Sports didn't hold back, calling Georgia's performance dominating. So, was this a case of Georgia just being that good? Or did Texas expose some serious weaknesses?
It's interesting. It's kind of both. Texas, up to this point, they haven't really faced a defense quite like Georgia's. Just think about it. Georgia's D had the Longhorns looking completely lost out there. CBS even pointed out how unusual that was for them. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean Texas is doomed or anything, but it does show they're vulnerable, especially if they run into another team with a suffocating defense. But gotta give credit where credit's due. Georgia. They made a statement, went into a hostile environment, and just completely shut Texas down.
Yeah, Georgia came to play. But is one loss, even when this decisive, enough to write off Texas?
Not necessarily. I mean, every season has its turning points. Texas could easily use this as a wake-up call, a chance to regroup, reassess, come back stronger, or could be the reality check they needed. Only time will tell, I guess.
So it's gut check time in Texas. All right, with Texas out of the picture, at least for now, Oregon's looking at that #1 spot. Expert speaker, remind us, how often do we see the Ducks flying this high?
Honestly, Oregon at #1 is more of a rare bird than you might think. They've only hit that top ranking for a grand total of 8 weeks, ever, in AP poll history. And get this, 7 of those were back-to-back in 2010. They had a brief stint at #1 in 2012, but it only lasted a week.
Wow, so history's not exactly on their side. What are the chances they can hold on this time around?
It'll be tough, no doubt. CBS is already pointing to their upcoming game against Illinois, and Illinois has been a real surprise this year as a major hurdle. If Oregon wants to silence the doubters, they got to beat a quality opponent like Illinois, convincingly.
Speaking of Illinois,
Yeah.
their rise this season has been pretty remarkable. They're projected to move up to number 18 after another win this week. They're sitting pretty at 6-1, and their only loss so far was to, you guessed it, Penn State.
And it's not just that they're winning, it's how they're winning. This Illinois team, they're playing with confidence, with swagger. We haven't seen this from them in, well, years.
Yeah, they're not just winning games, they're making a statement.
Exactly. I mean, they dominated Nebraska last week, and that was after their star quarterback, Curtis Work, went down with an injury at halftime. This Illinois team, they're for real. And that upcoming game against Oregon could be a preview of the playoff picture. Who knows?
Talk about a clash of styles. Definitely be keeping an eye on that one. But before we get ahead of ourselves, back to Georgia for a sec. They just knocked off the #1 team, yet CBS only has them moving up to #3.
Yeah.
Help us out here, expert speaker. What's the logic there?
It all boils down to how the rankings work. Yeah, beating the #1 team is huge, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't automatically mean you get to be #1. The AP poll, it factors in things like strength of schedule, margin of victory, and your overall performance throughout the season. Georgia had that early loss to Alabama, and we'll get into them a bit more later, but that loss is probably why they're not #1 right now.
So even though they crushed Texas, that Alabama loss is still coming back to haunt them.
Exactly. But hey, if Georgia keeps racking up these impressive wins, they'll climb that ladder in their next few games. Crucial, not just for the rankings, but for their playoff hopes too.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. All right, so we've got Oregon and Georgia battling it out for the top spots. But further down the rankings, things get really interesting. We've got not 1, not 2, but 3 undefeated teams. We're talking Army, Navy, and of course Illinois, who we just talked about. Expert speaker, are these teams legit contenders, or are we going to see some rude awakenings as the season heats up?
Now, this is where things get really exciting. Army and Navy, particularly, they've been turning heads. Both 6-0, undefeated in conference play. And they're putting up some serious points. CBS even highlighted Army's quarterback, Bryson Daly. He's already shattered their single-season rushing touchdown record. He's electric. So hard to defend against.
Seriously, when's the last time we saw service academies lighting up the scoreboard like this? I'm half expecting them to bust out the triple option pass for a touchdown at this rate.
Right. It's been a show. But, big question. Can they keep this up against tougher opponents? They've feasted on weaker competition so far, but their schedules are only going to get tougher. These next few weeks, they'll be tested. We'll see what they're really made of.
And what about Illinois? They're undefeated in conference play, too, sitting at a very respectable 6-1.
Yeah, Illinois is a different beast. They've proven they can hang with the big dogs. That close loss to Penn State proves that. Key for them, consistency, no slip-ups. If they can keep building on this momentum, they'll be a force.
It's almost as if they're being underestimated, even with this win streak. What do you make of this whole surprise factor with these teams?
Oh, it's definitely a thing. People overlook teams that haven't been in the national spotlight. But these teams, they're letting their play do the talking. They deserve to be taken seriously.
Records speak louder than reputations, I guess you could say. All right, let's talk about some other teams making some noise. Michigan, for example, they're projected to drop out of the top 25 completely after that brutal loss. Ouch. Then there's Alabama, hanging on at number 15 with a 5-2 record after that upset against Tennessee. Are they living on borrowed time in the top 25? And finally, Indiana. They've been quietly climbing the ranks, and now they're projected to be number 12. What's their secret?
All right, let's break it down. Michigan, their fall from grace has been, well, pretty dramatic. 2 losses in a row will do that. And the whispers about their coach's job security are getting louder, let me tell you. It just goes to show, in college football, 1 minute you're a top 10 team, the next you're on the outside looking in. Brutal.
Talk about a fall from grace. From the top 10 to out of the rankings in a blink of an eye. You got to stay on your toes in this sport. Speaking of fickle, let's talk Alabama. 2 losses already. Is this the beginning of the end of an era?
It's tempting to think that, especially with how shaky they've looked at times. CBS even mentioned how different this Alabama team looks compared to the squad that started the season at number 1 just 3 weeks ago. But, and this is a big but, we're still talking about Alabama. Nick Saban. They always seem to find a way to reload, to bounce back, way too early to count them out completely.
So you're saying they might have a few more tricks up their sleeve.
Never underestimate Nick Saban. Never underestimate the Crimson Tide. They love proving the doubters wrong. This season, who knows? Maybe it's a bump in the road. Maybe it's a sign of things to come. We'll just have to wait and see.
Never a dull moment with Alabama, that's for sure. All right, let's end on a high note. Indiana. They've been quietly putting together a heck of a season at 6-1, steadily climbing the rankings. What's the key to their success?
Indiana's success, it all comes down to one guy. Their coach, Curt Cignetti. He's built a program that's disciplined, physical. They might not have the star power of some of these other teams, but they're greater than the sum of their parts. That's coaching.
A true underdog story. And on that note, we'll be back in a moment to take a closer look at the playoff picture, those Cinderella stories brewing, and everything else you need to watch for in the coming weeks. Stay with us.
And we're back taking a deeper dive into the unpredictable world of college football. We've covered the top dogs, the underdogs, and everyone in between. But expert speaker, you mentioned the playoff picture before the break. With all these shakeups, what's your take on how things are shaping up for those coveted playoff spots?
Right now. Got to like Oregon's chances. They're undefeated, got that big win over Ohio State early on, and they're in the driver's seat for the Pac-12 championship.
You're saying a playoff spot is theirs to lose at this point.
It's early, sure, but they're in a good spot. That Week 9 matchup against Illinois, though, that's going to be huge. A win there, and they're looking golden. A loss throws everything wide open, gives other contenders a chance.
Every game is basically a playoff game from here on out. So we've got Oregon as a front runner, but they've got a big test coming up. Who else is in that playoff mix? Georgia's win against Texas, that puts them right back in the conversation. Their defense has been unbelievable. If they can keep that up, they're going to be a problem for anyone.
But that early loss to Alabama, it's still hanging over their heads, isn't it?
It is. The SEC is a meat grinder. One loss can be the difference between a playoff berth and a New Year's Six bowl. But if any team can overcome a slip-up like that, it's a Kirby Smart-coached Georgia team.
They've got the track record to prove it.
Yeah.
All right, those undefeated teams we were talking about, Army, Navy, could they actually make a run at the playoffs? That would be something else.
Long shot, for sure. But hey, this is college football. Crazier things have happened. The committee's shown they're willing to consider teams from outside the Power Five, especially if they've got the resume to back it up.
We're talking about Army or Navy not just making a New Year's Six bowl, but actually competing for a national championship. Talk about a Cinderella story.
Wouldn't that be something? But let's be realistic. There's strength of schedule. That's a big hurdle. The committee, they put a lot of weight on that. And right now, neither Army nor Navy has played the same level of competition as some of these other top teams.
So what you're saying is for Army or Navy to even have a shot, they need some help, some chaos in the rankings, a few upsets.
The favorites need to stumble, right?
Bingo. They need some serious shakeups. A few upsets could change everything, but it's a narrow path, very narrow. Now, on the other side of the coin, you've got teams trying to claw their way back into the conversation. We talked about Michigan's struggles. Then there's Alabama. What's their path back to the playoffs? Can they even come back from 2 losses?
$1 million question.
It's a tough road, historically. It's incredibly rare for a 2-loss team to make the playoffs. Since they expanded it to 4 teams back in 2014, only one 2-loss team has ever done it. And it was Alabama back in 2017.
So not only do they have to win out, they need a miracle. Pretty much. They need a lot of help. Those teams ahead of them need to lose. And Alabama has to win out dominantly. The committee needs to believe they're one of the 4 best teams in the country, even with those 2 losses.
So, long shot for Alabama, but hey, never say never, right? Especially with Saban calling the shots. Now, what about a team like Indiana? They're quietly putting together a great season at 6-1, climbing the rankings. What's their playoff path look like?
Indiana's interesting. They're flying under the radar a bit, but they keep winning, and they're proving they belong in this conversation. Their schedule's tough the rest of the way. But if they can run the table, win the Big Ten championship, they'll have a strong case.
So for Indiana, it's all about controlling what they can control. Win the big games and hope for a little luck along the way.
Exactly, and that's what makes this time of year so exciting. Every week, something new, upsets, surprises. The playoff race is wide open, and I, for one, can't wait to see how it all plays out.
And we're back, wrapping things up here on our deep dive into college football. Expert speaker, this has been a great conversation. You've given us a lot to think about. But before we go, I always like to leave our listeners with something to ponder, something to chew on as they watch the rest of the season unfold. What's your parting shot for them this week?
You know, we spend so much time, dissecting these rankings, analyzing every single playoff scenario, arguing about which teams have the best shot at winning it all. But I think sometimes we forget that there's more to college football than just the final score.
I like where you're going with this.
What if, instead of obsessing over every win and loss, we just, took a step back, appreciated those individual moments, the stories, the athleticism. That's what makes the sport so great.
It's about the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. So yeah, as we head into these last few weeks of the season, let's just savor it all. The amazing catches, the goal line stands, the passion, the dedication. Every Saturday, that's the heart and soul of college football right there.
Well said. A good reminder that sometimes the best victories aren't the ones on the scoreboard. And on that note, we'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into college football. Until next time.